Welcome to the Butterfly Effect. I'm Chris Horner. This is stage 15 of the Vuelta, España. Now today's stage at 152 kilometers, 95 miles in length. It's right there at that wheelhouse where a lot of the professionals have a lot of power throughout the stage of this distance. But when we look at the finishing, two climbs on today's stage. One climb at 9 kilometers, 7.5% is the penultimate climb. And then, of course, the finishing climb at over 19 kilometers, averaging 8% on this climb up to Sierra Nevada. But it's the first part of the climb, the first 4 or 5 kilometers that I want you to focus on, because as I told you yesterday on the Butterfly Effect, that is where all the action will begin and start to blow the field up amongst the GC favorites if it's anything like it was in 2013 when I did it on stage 10 of that year's Vuelta España. It's incredibly technical at the bottom, but it's so steep it's not really technical. It's twisty, tight, 180-degree turns, 15% sections all the way from the bottom for that about first 4 or 5 kilometers of this finishing climb. Now after that, the last 14 kilometers, it's going to ease up a little bit, and that's why you see the gradients at average at 8%, is because this last part's going to be more of probably around 6% when we're talking about going to the finish line. It's a bit faster section on this last almost 20-kilometer climb here on stage 15 of the Vuelta España. Now, if you guys watched yesterday's stage 14, we saw that REMCO Evenepoel from Quick-Step, he had some problems, and Primoz Roglic, Jumbo-Visma, put some time into him on the general classification. So when you're watching the beginning of today's stage, the DS director there for Quick-Step, he says that REMCO Evenepoel woke up feeling good today, and they expected yesterday to be bad, and they believe it's the effects of the crash that he had 2 days ago. Now, just before the racing gets started, the Ineos director sportif, he says they want to go for some more stage wins, of course, on today's stage. So we know the action's going to be thick at the beginning of the race, and from kilometer 0, there's big times attacks as we see Hugh Carthy and Rowan Dennis from Jumbo-Visma going up the road. Now, normally I don't like putting in your big guys up in the front group, but for Rowan Dennis, he hasn't been climbing great. And I saw some comments last night that thought that for sure Rowan Dennis would be in the early move, and I agreed with it. That was a fantastic plan, and normally I don't like this plan, but when we look at Rowan Dennis, he doesn't have a ton of climbing force. And if he can get over the first 4 or 5 kilometers of this last 19-kilometer climb when it starts to ease up, he might be there for Primoz Roglic, because you know the action, like I already said, is going to be thick at the beginning of this last climb. So we're keeping that in mind when you're watching Rowan Dennis and Hugh Carthy from EF Education up the road. They got 4 riders chasing, and then eventually we'll see Vincenzo Nibali bridge up there to make 7 riders in the front group. Shortly after that, though, the speed is not stopping in the peloton. There's attacks going left and right, and then we see 3 guys up the road out of that 7 because the other 4 guys got dropped. It's Vincenzo Nibali, Hugh Carthy, and of course Rowan Dennis. Now let me remind you guys, Vincenzo Nibali's on his last season here of his career, but he has won the Vuelta España, and he is familiar with this climb because I had the battle with him on the Hacianas climb here at the finish of this stage 14. So 3 guys up there pulling hard, but behind the peloton is not slowing down. We're going to see a crash from Wilco Kelderman, who's in the top 10 of the general classification, riding for Bora Hansgrohe. He takes his time to get up, and he is beat up, but he will find his way back up to the peloton eventually. Now there'll be one other crash from DSM rider going into the roundabout that'll lose his front tire because, again, these are slippery roads. He'll go down and get back up and have to chase to get back on. Now up front, we're seeing full gas up there. It's Bora Hansgrohe throwing in attacks. We see our Ensman, DSM rider, if you remember right, he was in that big breakaway on stage 9 that went all the way to the finish that Menkes won for Intermarché, but he dropped out and went back to the peloton. Remember, while they were taking a nature break, he's having none of those kind of tactics today. He wants in the front breakaway, and our Ensman's throwing down. He's got Carapaz up there with him, Jay Vine up there, and then eventually it's a massive size group up there of just under 30 riders. So we got another MO, just like we've seen on earlier stages here at the Vuelta España with big breakaways. One other thing to keep in mind when you're looking at this almost 30 rider breakaway group, every rider in the top 10 has teammates up there. When we're talking about Quick Step, they don't have just one, they have two, because they have Fausto Masnada up there and Vervaeke. Vervaeke's their pure climber, and Fausto Masnada's not bad in the mountains either. So with those two riders up there, Quick Step like having them up there, and they're not going to pull them back. Now, other guys to keep in mind, Jumbo-Visma, they got two riders up there too. Sam Omen, their climber, and Rowan Dennis made that front group. When we go back even further, UAE Team Emirates have riders represented up there. Brandon McNulty's there. Soler is in that front group. And so when we look at all these riders in the top 10, everybody has a rider, if not two riders, in this front group. Now, our Insman's the highest rider in the general classification at 11th on GC. So when we go back to the peloton and you look at Remco Evenepoel along with his two other teammates from Quick Step, they're slowing this group down, and we're about 130 kilometers to go to the finish of today's stage. When that break finally gets away, they'll start slowing it down somewhere about 125, and then we start seeing the gap go out and start to extend to this front group of 30. Now, when we look about this break, they're not really pushing the pace too hard. We'll see a crash early when this break started from Nicolas Perdome from AG2R, and I thought he didn't make it back up to that group. I had to wait for the race to finish to see that he did make it into that front group, but it was curious because there's going to be some strange tactics employed from AG2R later in the race. Now, we go up through the first KOM. It's going to be Jay Vine from Albacete de Koenig that gets maximum points here. The KOM leader already is going to pad his point lead here on stage 15 of the Vuelta a España. Their time gap's up to about 4.5 minutes at this point in time, and it'll extend a little bit more before the finish of today's stage. But once we get about 65, just under 70 kilometers to go, we're going to see AG2R get on the front, and they're going to start pulling. AG2R, Ben O'Connor sitting 10th on the general classification, and I told you guys already, our Insman was up in that front group, and he was 11th on GC. So AG2R don't want to lose a top 10 on the general classification. Now, when I was sitting on the couch, I'm thinking, Ben O, what are you thinking right here, putting your guys on the front? Is it the director sportif calling it, or does Ben O'Connor have some fantastic legs here, and he wants to try to move up on the general classification and do something special? Now, with AG2R pulling hard on the front with at least two guys, they're drilling it 100%. And every time you look up at this almost 30 rider group in the front up the road, these guys are just kind of hanging around a little bit. Now, just before AG2R went on the front, there was an attack with about 80 kilometers to go, and that was Lawson Craddock from Bike Exchange going solo. So with one solo rider up the road, UAE Team Emirates chasing full gas, and this break of about 28, 29 riders chasing in between, we can tell they're not going that fast because remember, it's only Lawson Craddock up the road, and they're not bringing back the lone American rider from Bike Exchange. Now we start getting into the town just before the penultimate climb starts. This is a crazy town. I remember doing it in 2013. It's full gas, it's narrow, it's twisty and technical, and so you got to be in the right position because this next climb coming up is a stiff, hard climb. You go through this town, you drop down this descent, and then when you start to climb, it's kind of like cutting through the back alley and leaving the town and going up through some canyon road that's just completely empty, small, narrow road. Pavement's not so good, and when we get on that, it's AG2R that's still on the front. Now, Jumbo-Visma's Mike Tunison did a little bit right at the beginning for about 500 meters and then blew. Then AG2R got on the front and really started setting some tempo going up this climb. Now, we'll see in the breakaway up front, it's Jay Vine, Albacete de Koenig near the top. As that group got smaller and smaller, Jay Vine sees a little bit of a gap when he looks over his shoulder. He douses himself with some water, and then he realizes he's got to get up there to Lawson Craddock so he can get some maximum KOM points. Now, the gap was about 25-40 seconds when Jay Vine decided to jump across, and it was questionable whether if he's going to make it, but Jay Vine's got good form, and he'll bridge across with about 900 meters, 600 meters to go before the top of the KOM, and he'll catch Lawson Craddock and then gain maximum points again here late into this stage 15 in the Vuelta a España. Now behind in the GC group, it's going fast. We see the field hit this climb proper, and it's starting to blow up just like it has every year in the past when I've done the Vuelta a España and we've passed through this canyon road. As we see the group getting smaller and smaller, there's probably about 35 guys left in this front group with AG2R drilling it. And when we look at the picture, it's race leaders, red jersey wearer here, Remco Evenepoel, and and he's isolated with no teammates. We look just a little further back and you'll see Van Wilder just making it back onto the back end of the group of about 35 riders to give Remco Evenepoel some help. But here's the reason why I don't like having the two riders up front when we're talking about Fausto Masnada in that front group and Vervaeke, is at this point in time, when you look at Remco Evenepoel, they're going up the climb, it's single filed out. Remco Evenepoel has no rider in front of him. Now, when I did this climb in 2013 and we were finishing on stage 10, I had riders in front of me because I had Fabian Cancellara setting a devastating tempo up this climb, but I was always kept out of the wind. Remco Evenepoel, when things start to go single file, remember, he can't have that rider that's just sitting off just a little bit. So if the wind's coming a little bit from the right to the left or the left to the right, whichever way it might be, you could always get yourself out of trouble if you put a teammate there. But Remco Evenepoel, he's isolated with the exception of Van Wilder, that's way at the back, probably 36th position. So we start getting further up this climb, and all of a sudden Jumbo-Visma get on the front and they start drilling it going into this KOM, as we know the top of the climb is going to finish. Just as they're crossing the top of the KOM, Movistar go to the front because they know this descent is going to be a dangerous one. Now, guys, the road gets better when they come out of this narrow canyon road and start the descent proper. But every year when I've done this in the Vuelta a España, I'm telling you the speeds are fast. You're doing 80, 90, 100 kilometers an hour through these turns. I would prefer complete 180-degree hairpin turns versus when you're going 80, 90, 100 kilometers an hour in these turns. You can feel the tires just start to come, like lose traction on the concrete. And remember, we're down south, so it's slippery out. Now, Remco Evenepoel, like I said, he didn't have much teammates around him with the exception of Van Wilder, but he was still further back when they went over the top of the KOM. And right away, when we see the group of GC favorites, it's Dylan Van Barley that's off to the side. I'm not certain if he crashed or dropped his chain, but for certain, he's going to lose some time on today's stage. This is what I'm talking about when you have riders up in front and you don't have big numbers in quick step team. Right now, when you're going down the descent, if something like this was to happen to Remco Evenepoel, he only has one teammate left in that group. Of course, two riders still up the road with Fausto Masnada and, of course, with Vervaeke in the front group. But that would take them a long time to come back. The Vuelta a España would be lost right on this descent if Remco Evenepoel was to miss a chain or go off the road. Now, further as we get down to the descent, it's Trek Segafredo Antonio going through the left bend. He can't make the turn. He's off into the dirt, locks the brake up, straightens the bike up, goes straight through the bushes, and somehow comes back out onto the road. He'll lose that front group of breakaway riders up the road, though, as he went off the road, and he's going to spend a long time chasing. Now, behind, we go back to the GC favorites. Again, it's Remco Evenepoel that's a bit isolated. Finally, he's starting to get one teammate up there, Van Wilder, next to his side. But when we start looking up front, guess who's on the front? It's Jumbo-Visma, and they're pulling full gas. Now, after you finish this descent, it's still not going to start the last 20-kilometer climb because they got to go through some small, narrow roads, a couple other towns, up to a dam, and then they go along the side of the dam, and then some crazy descents before you start the last climb proper. When we start coming off the descent, you see it's Jumbo-Visma on the front, and Primož Roglič needs to take a nature break right now. We're getting close to the finish. We're talking about 30 kilometers before we get to the finish line, and only about 10 kilometers before you start the last climb. But Primož Roglič, if you gotta go, you gotta go. He's got some help from one of his teammates, giving him a little push, and then he tells him to go ahead and take off. Remco Evenepoel will go back to the car, grab some water bottles, and then find his way back up to the back of the peloton. Now, when we start nearing the climb, the final climb here on stage 15, it's a technical descent, but we'll see the Jumbo-Visma riders, two of them come back out of that original group. It's Rowan Dennis and it's Sam Oman, who couldn't stay up the road with that front group. Now, the tactic for Jumbo-Visma wouldn't have been to pull both these guys back. It would have been to have them up at the top of that first 4 or 5 kilometers of today's final climb so that they can be up there to meet Primož Roglič to come across. So you know Jumbo-Visma is not having a good day, but the question is Primož Roglič having a good day? He's found his way back up to the front, and like I said, all his teammates are wrapped around him right now as we start to look at Jumbo-Visma putting the plan B into effect. Now we see Rowan Dennis pulling on the front 100%. And as we come down to the last little technical descent before we start the final climb, there's a hard hairpin turn to the right, and that's where we're going to see Fausto Masnada, the quick-step rider who came out of the break along with the Jumbo-Visma riders at the same point in time. He can't make that turn. He goes off the road and causes a little chaos back there in the GC favorites. There'll be splits all over the place as the GC riders are going to start the final climb here with about 20 kilometers to go on stage 15. Up front, Marc Soler went into the final climb with a gap on everybody of about 25-30 seconds. The UAE Team Emirates rider, he's trying to go solo and he wants to set his own pace. We've seen throughout this year's Vuelta a España when Soler has been dropped off the back, always on the early attacks, and then somehow finds his way back up and even won a stage here at the Vuelta a España during the first week when we first entered Spain. Now Soler's going 100%. He's got some company back there chasing him in the form of Rigoberto Urán, our Ensman from DSM, Gino Mater from Bahrain Victorious, Jai Hindley, the Giro, the Italian winner this year, Jay Vine, the KOM wearer, De La Cruz from Astana. He's got a couple teammates back in the GC favorites. And Minquez, who won stage 9 of this year's Vuelta a España, the stage when our Ensman dropped out of that front group. Now behind, when we start seeing the peloton, as they hit this first part of the climb here, this last climb of the stage 15 of the Vuelta a España, on the front it's Sam Oomen, and he's blowing everything up. Only problem is Sam Oomen's going too hard. You look at the gap, he's blowing everything up, and they can't close it. Sam Oomen's there, and then we see Primoz Roglic, and Roglic is trying to close the gap up to Sam Oomen. When he does, Sam pulls off, and he's done. Then Remco Evenepoel gets on the front and looks like he's ready to start setting some tempo. And I'm sitting on the couch. Don't do it, Remco Evenepoel. This is a 20-kilometer climb. You don't want to get on the front right at this point in time. And remember, you got teammates back there because Fausto Masnada, who was in the earlier break, who came back and then crashed, basically did nothing for the race leaders, Remco Evenepoel. But you got to remember, he's still back there, and Van Wilder must be back there. But Remco Evenepoel is going to hop on the front. Not for too long. Now, this was a tactical mistake. I thought at this moment from Jumbo-Visma, maybe just let Remco Evenepoel up there and see how much he's going to pull, but they're not going to do it. As we see, Chris Harper gets on the front. Now, Chris Harper's got some change of form, just like we've seen with Primoz Roglic, because Harper's up there and he's just blowing this group up to pieces. First rider we start seeing coming off the back is Almeida from UAE Team Emirates, and then Ayuso from UAE Team Emirates is coming off the back just a little bit after his teammate Almeida. Those two guys are going to be chasing the front group for a long time, and now we know Chris Harper has some form because he's got this group down to a select guys of Remco Evenepoel, Mas, Lopez, and of course his teammate Primoz Roglic. They still got about a 3.5 minute gap if they got any shot at winning today's stage, though, because up front Soler is still putting on a show. Now we get only a couple kilometers further, and all of a sudden it's Primoz Roglic going to work because Chris Harper's pulling off hard stage left, and it's time for Primoz Roglic to see what kind of damage he can do to the race leader's red jersey. He starts accelerating hard, but Remco Evenepoel is not budging. He's locked in. All the company of the high GC riders, though. Enric Mas is there. Ben O'Connor, 10th on general classification. Man, are you having a ride? Still locked in with the front group. Lopez, 7th on the general classification. He's there. And Enric Mas, Movistar, is not budging. He looks solid in this front group, being led by Primoz Roglic. Now, Roglic will be up there for about 2 kilometers, and then Remco Evenepoel will take over once Primoz Roglic pulls off hard to the left. Primoz Roglic is sitting second wheel, and then all of a sudden, with the effort from Remco Evenepoel, Primoz Roglic pulls out to the left and drops back to the back of the train. They're sitting about 5th, 6th position. Now, with Remco Evenepoel on front, he's setting a steady tempo. Of course, not worried about what's happening in that front group, but going hard. Remco Evenepoel pulled for a few kilometers, and then his teammate Louis Vervaeke is back and caught at about 14 kilometers to go. With Vervaeke hopping on the front, you know he's going to sell out 100% for his race leader in the red jersey, Remco Evenepoel. Now, just at the same time when Vervaeke was coming back, you look at the picture there, it's Carapaz from Team Ineos, and he's dropping back, going back to look for Carlos Rodriguez. Now, he'll meet up with Carlos Rodriguez, who has Ayuso on his wheel, and just when we look further back on the camera, there it's Almeida, UAE Team Emirates, trying to bridge up as we see Richard Carapaz trying to drill it for Carlos Rodriguez. Now, Almeida will dig deep, and somehow, for some way, the UAE Team Emirates Portuguese rider will find his way back up to the train of Richard Carapaz. We look further up front now with about 10 kilometers to go. It's time for Miguel Angel Lopez to throw in an attack. He throws in a devastating attack and gets an instant gap. Then 200 meters later, guess what? Enric Mas, Movistar, he's had enough waiting around and he's trying to go. We look further up the road. It's De La Cruz from Astana who is in that front group of 30. He's dropped out of that group. That's now about a dozen, 14 riders up front with our Ensman leading it. With him dropping back to Lopez's wheel, we know he's going to go go 100%. Now we look just a little bit further back as it's De La Cruz on the front. We see it's Mas trying to close the gap up to Lopez. If he can get up there, he can start putting some pressure on Primož Roglič and Remco Evenepoel in the race leader's jersey behind. Now, we look back at the GC favorites, first and second, that is. It's still Vervaeke that's on the front for Remco Evenepoel. We go just a little bit further behind that, and guess what? Carapaz has almost got the gap closed with his teammate Carlos Rodriguez, with Ayuso and Almeida locked onto his wheel. Only problem is soon Vervaake's going to be done. We see him go past the feeder. He grabs the bottle, hands it over to his race leader in the red jersey, Remco Evenepoel, and then starts pulling for about another 200-300 meters before he blows. And now it's time for Remco Evenepoel to go to work with that big acceleration. All of a sudden, when we look back, Richard Carapaz is done for Team Ineos. He pulls off, and that means it's going to be Carlos Rodriguez, Ayuso, and Almeida that have to bridge this gap. Now, Ayuso's not messing around. He's going to jump away from Carlos Rodriguez and get a gap. And when we look further back again, Ayuso's pulling on the front. Almeida's going to jump him and go across to his teammate Ayuso. Now, up front, when we're talking about Enric Mas and Lopez, Lopez is going 100% because now David De La Cruz has just pulled off the front. Lopez is digging in deep. Enric Mas is pulling hard because he's trying to get the red race leader's jersey here at the Vuelta a España on stage 15. Up front with about 8 kilometers to go, it's our Ensman from DSM. He's throwing in his attack on his group of breakaway companions because he's still got Soler up the road at about 30 seconds. Now our Ensman's digging deep, taking about 7 kilometers to go to catch the back end of Soler. And then just a few hundred meters after that, our Ensman throws in attack, and we see Soler coming out the back. The UAE Team Emirates rider, he was trying to do a devastating job to try to win here on stage 15, but now our Ensman is trying to get some redemption all the way back from that stage 9 when he dropped himself out of the break when it was Menkes that won that stage. Now our Ensman, he's getting a gap on the breakaway companions behind us. He's got a 40-second gap, a 50-second gap. But the problem is, when we look further back, Mas and Lopez have caught his breakaway companions, and now they're not messing around. They're going straight through all those riders, and it's Enric Mas going up the road along with Lopez and Jay Vine locked on for company. Now we get under about 2 kilometers to go. We start looking at the gap, and all of a sudden we see it's 1 minute and 20 seconds to our Ensman, and our Ensman's not slowing down for DSM. He is going 100% with 1K to go. We know our Ensman has this stage 15 won, and as he crosses the line, we'll see him celebrating at the finish because he knows he's won the Queen stage here of the Vuelta a España Sierra Nevada climb. Now let's go further down the hill because we got a battle for the race leader's red jersey here. Enric Mas and Lopez, they're digging 100%. Jay Vine's holding on for dear life. Enric Mas got one more big acceleration that'll dislodge Lopez. He'll cross the line for second on the stage, plus the time bonuses, and then third on the stage will be Lopez. Jay Vine will cross the stage to get fourth on today's stage and some more KOM points to pad his lead here on stage 15. Behind them, with about 1 kilometer to go, Primož Roglič decided it was time to attack, and he threw in a monster attack on Remco Evenepoel, but couldn't get much more than about a 20-second gap holding off Remco Evenepoel. But guess what? Ben O'Connor stayed on the wheel of Primož Roglič to cross the line even time with Primož Roglič of about 21 seconds behind Enric Mas's time, so he'll still hold second place on the general classification because behind Remco Evenepoel, who just stayed steady like a diesel engine all the way up this final climb, only loses about 15 seconds to Primož Roglič and 36 seconds to Enric Mas. So of course he's going to hold on to the race leader's red jersey. Now, there was one rider that placed in front of Remco Evenepoel, and that was Juan Ayuso from UAE Team Emirates. They didn't show when he caught Remco Evenepoel, dropped him, and went up to gain a little bit of time. But when we look at the final general classification, we see he jumped over Carlos Rodriguez from Ineos for 4th on the GC, and then Carlos Rodriguez went to 5th on the general classification. Lopez moved up. Ben O'Connor moved up on the general classification. Theo Gegenhardt moved off the top 10. And of course, Wilco Kelderman, who crashed at the beginning of today's stage 15, he dropped out of the top 10 on the general classification too. Now, epic battle. We've seen today's stage. It lived up to the billing of being the queen stage here at the Vuelta España. Quick-Step pulled some kind of different tactics in my book, but of course, Luis Vervacchi was there to help out Remco Evenepoel at a crucial point in time, so maybe it was a good plan, but I don't know, because I always like my guys around me throughout the whole stage, especially at the crucial moments, and then I'll find a way to stay with the best in the world if I got those kind of legs at the finish of the stage. Quick-Step, though, they held it together. Remco Evenepoel was solid all the way to the finish to not lose much time to anybody on the general classification. So we got some big battles here at the Vuelta España still to come when we leave tomorrow's rest day and we start racing again on Tuesdays for stage 16 of the Vuelta España. Make sure you like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next edition real soon.